The sun was beating down on a bridge construction site in Zhejiang way back in early 1768. A stonemason was hard at work, driving these heavy wooden piles into the riverbed with these rhythmic, bone-shaking strikes.
Right. Grueling work.
Totally. And out of nowhere, a local farmer approaches him. But he doesn't offer a bribe or a drink. Instead, he hands over a slip of paper with a name scrawled on it.
And an instruction.
An instruction. "Nail this to the pile," the farmer whispered. The logic was as simple as it was, chilling. Every time the mason's heavy mallet struck the bridge, it would simultaneously strike the soul of the person named on that paper.
So by the time the pile was driven deep into the earth, that person's spirit would be, crushed?
Crushed, leaving them a hollow shell. Now, to you and me, this looks like nothing more than a desperate, maybe even pathetic act of rural superstition.
And the stonemason apparently thought so too?
He did. He was an honest man, and instead of taking part in this curse, he reported the farmer to the local magistrate. And you would expect the story to end right there. A minor fine, maybe a lecture on feudal nonsense.
But it didn't.
Not even close. This tiny incident in a remote village acted like a spark in a room just filled with gas. Within months, a wave of soul-stealing hysteria swept across the Qing Empire.
An empire that was, and this is the crucial part, at the absolute zenith of its power and prosperity.
Exactly. Suddenly, people everywhere were terrified of strangers, of whispered names, and, most dangerously, anyone carrying a pair of scissors.
And what's really unsettling isn't the folklore itself. I mean, every culture has stories like this. It's how the most powerful man in the world reacted.
The Qianlong emperor. When the reports reached the Forbidden City, he didn't see superstition. He saw conspiracy. He didn't see ghosts. He saw black hands and hidden rebels.
And by the time the panic peaked, a simple fear of magic had transformed into a brutal, state-sponsored political purge.
It turned neighbors into informants and allowed ordinary people to wield the terrifying power of the law just to settle personal scores. So the question is, how did a Golden Age empire fall into such a collective madness?
And why was the emperor so convinced that a few cut braids and paper charms were the key to toppling his throne?
Let's look into the soul stealers of 1768.
It's just an incredible origin story for what became a genuine nationwide catastrophe. You see this rapid, almost unnerving transition from a very local, deeply personalized folk curse.
For the idea of using the physical force of construction to crush a person's soul.
Exactly. It goes from that to becoming the central obsessive focus of the entire Qing state. And this is all happening under the Qianlong emperor, who's presiding over the dynasty's longest period of peace, its most flourishing age.
Which presents us with this immediate puzzle, doesn't it?
A huge one. How did the ruler of the largest, most centralized empire on earth, a man with this, staggering military and bureaucratic machine, choose to deal with raw rural magic?
He didn't just dismiss it. He took it and he transformed it into a vast political conspiracy aimed primarily at his own government, his own officials.
And the ethnic tensions that really underpinned his entire reign. So for this deep dive, we're going into the historical analysis of this period. We're moving way beyond the folklore to look at the hidden social and political fault lines of what we call the High Qing era.
Our mission here is to understand why a powerful autocrat would choose fear as his primary tool of internal governance and what the real costs were.
Yeah, this isn't just a story about a witch hunt. It's a terrifying commentary on power, on paranoia, and on bureaucracy.
So we have to start by defining the source of the fear itself. The Chinese term for this alleged sorcery was jiao. Before we get into the politics, what did the common person in 1768 actually believe was happening to them? How were these thieves supposed to be operating?
Well, jiao, or soul stealing, was profoundly terrifying because it targeted the intangible essence of life, the key. The popular belief was that sorcerers were roaming the land, trying to steal the vital essence of their victim.
And not just to harm them, right? There was a purpose.
There was a purpose. The goal was to use that stolen essence for magical purposes, often to empower construction charms, like we saw with the bridge, or to give the sorcerer power over others, maybe even extend their own life at the victim's expense.
So the victims, what would happen to them? They just wither away.
They were believed to suffer sudden sickness, malaise, or even death. They become a hollow, listless shell of their former selves.
And what makes this particular superstition so historically important is that the methods of theft were so specific. They were, easily reproducible, which is probably why the fear went viral.
That's the key. That is the mechanism of contagion. It wasn't vague black magic. It was focused on very concrete, very vulnerable objects. The danger felt immediate because the methods were so mundane.
And the most politically volatile method was the clipping of the queue?
The queue, yes. This was the long braided hair worn by all Chinese men at the time. A sorcerer might, sneak up in a crowd or while you're sleeping and snip off just a few strands from the end of the braid.
The sources also mention clothing, right? Like clipping a piece of a lapel.
Yes, or just a scrap of fabric. And that would be used, often with a person's written name, to complete the curse. And that brings us back to that third method.
The one from the opening story, the name on the slip of paper.
Exactly. The initial incident in Zhejiang highlights it perfectly. The name written on a charm nailed to a bridge pile. The rhythmic force of the construction, the hammering, was believed to rhythmically crush the person's spirit.
So the fear was that the very act of building the infrastructure of this supposed golden age could be turned into a magical weapon against the citizens.
It's incredibly subversive when you think about it that way.
I want to spend a moment on the queue clipping, because this is where that popular fear crashes right into imperial power. Why was a man's hair such a valuable commodity for a sorcerer? Was it just that common belief that hair contains your essence?
That's certainly part of it, the folk belief. Hair, like clothing, contains a part of the person's essence. But the psychological fear around the queue is uniquely intense. You have to imagine living in a society where you can't safely trim your hair because any discarded clipping could be used to poison you spiritually.
And it was just a part of daily life, a constant thing to manage.
A constant source of maintenance, of itching, of discomfort. It was often poorly washed by the poor, which might make having a piece snipped off feel like a relief at first, but that could then be twisted into a violation. It made the threat feel so invasive, so persistent, it's attached to their very identity.
And crucially, the fear spread so wide that it meant anyone could be a victim. It blurred class lines.
Absolutely. While sorcery scares can often target the elites, powerful people whose harm would be most impactful, the victims of Jiao were incredibly varied. And that shows you the true depth of the social anxiety.
So not just landlords or officials.
No, we see reports of small children being targeted, which makes the fear visceral and primal for every parent. But victims also included laborers, fishmongers, petty landlords, even the wives of grain transporters.
So when the fear of having your soul stolen transcends class and geography like that, trust must just evaporate.
It evaporates completely. The entire social structure starts to break down.
And when a society loses trust, it starts looking for an external source to blame. Who became the immediate targets of this massive collective anxiety?
The accused were, overwhelmingly drawn from society's most vulnerable and marginalized populations. The sources show a really consistent pattern.
Let me guess. Outsiders.
Outsiders. Wandering sorcerers, beggars, and particularly roving clergy, so transient Buddhist monks and Taoist priests. These were the individuals who lacked fixed familial or village ties. They were the strangers in any community.
And they often relied on charity or performed, minor healing arts, which would make it easy to associate them with strange powers.
It made them perfect scapegoats. The existing social structure used the sorcery scare as a convenient vehicle to purge itself of these internal others, the people they were already suspicious of, the people who represented social instability.
So if a child gets sick in a village,
it's far easier to blame the itinerant beggar who passed through last week than to look for a known local enemy, or worse, except that the illness was just natural. The marginal status of the accused was their ultimate downfall. It shows how pre-existing biases were just weaponized by the mass hysteria.
What's so fascinating to me, given the sheer size of the Qing Empire and how slow communication was in the 18th century, is how rapidly this panic became a national phenomenon.
The speed of diffusion is astounding. The initial incident happened in Zhejiang, in a place called Diomging, in late January or early spring of 1768. And it didn't crawl, it ran.
Where did it go first?
It quickly spread to the really populous region south of the Yangtze River. By June, so just a few months later, it had reached the upper Yangtze. Then in early autumn, the rumors fully breached the North China Plain.
And by October?
By October, the fear had reached as far west as Shaanxi province.
That's thousands of miles in less than a year. How does a rumor even travel that fast without modern mass media?
Well, it traveled along the very networks that the state was often worried about. Trade routes, waterways, and just the movement of the population. Grain transport crews, internal migrants looking for work. Even the accused roving clergy themselves acted as unwitting vectors for the panic.
But there's another layer, isn't there? The official one.
Yes, and this is more important. When an official report, even one dismissing the rumors, was sent from one province to another, the very act of reporting validated the existence of the topic.
So a local magistrate might say, everything's fine here, no sorcerers, but by sending that report, he's put sorcery on the official agenda.
Exactly. It's a contagion effect, where the official communication network, which was intended to keep order, ironically became the superhighway for the panic itself.
And the moment that panic, localized energy reached the central government, the entire dynamic shifted. The emperor seized the panic not to dispel it, but to exploit it.
Which brings us to the emperor's real target. We've established the popular fear, but to understand his reaction, we have to understand why the specific method of queue clipping was a political ticking time bomb for him.
Let's define that political significance then, moving beyond magic. Because the queue was so much more than a style choice for the Qing dynasty.
It was everything. The queue, the shaved forehead, the long braid, was the most visceral, physical symbol of the Manchu conquest over the Han Chinese majority.
Oh.
When the Manchus seized control in 1644, they enforced the haircutting decree.
With that infamous choice, keep your hair, lose your head, lose your hair, keep your head.
A brutal policy, brutally enforced. The Han resistance to this was not insignificant. There were massive uprisings early in the dynasty's history, people fighting and dying specifically to avoid this humiliation.
In the 1640s and 50s, cities were massacred over this. Entire regions rebelled.
Absolutely. It was a massive psychological and political tool. It was used to demonstrate that the new rulers held absolute power over the bodies and the identities of the conquered population.
So fast forward to 1768. The king is stable, but the queue remains the single most important visible marker of loyalty and submission.
Exactly. So when reports of widespread concurrent queue clipping reached the Qianlong emperor, he instantly interpreted it through that lens, the lens of history and ethnic tension.
He wasn't thinking about magic?
No, he was thinking about the history of resistance. He was convinced that targeting the queue was not a coincidence. It had to be a deliberate, organized act of sedition by hidden anti-Qing rebels.
And the fact that the attacks were so widespread from Zhejiang to Shaanxi was, in his mind, proof.
Proof of a coordinated, massive, and highly dangerous network of black hands.
That sounds like a profound lack of confidence, though, especially since he was ruling during the so-called zenith of Qing power. Why was he so paranoid at the very apex of his dynasty?
The High Qing period was prosperous, that's true. But Qianlong, as a Manchu ruler of a Han empire, always lived with this underlying structural insecurity. He was presiding over a vast empire of 200 million Han Chinese who, culturally resented the foreign Manchu rule.
So the peace and prosperity might have just hidden those deep-seated fissures rather than solving them.
Exactly. His immediate leap to a conspiracy theory that a few cut braids meant a centrally coordinated rebellion was an expression of that deep, lingering anxiety about the legitimacy of his rule. He was convinced that prosperity had simply made the threat go underground.
So the moment he reframes this magical phenomenon as a political plot, the entire campaign becomes weaponized.
It does. And the real enemy wasn't the supposed rebels. It was the bureaucracy itself.
That's the core of the analysis, isn't it? He was looking for sorcerers, but he was really deploying a political tool to discipline his own functionaries.
He was genuinely enraged that local officials had initially dismissed the rumors as mere peasant superstition. He felt his own officials were suffering from what historians have called the gravitational inertia of officialdom.
Gravitational inertia? What does that look like in practice?
It's the complacency of a long-established, highly prosperous, but aging bureaucracy. The Qing system was huge, hierarchical, and slow. After decades of peace, officials preferred to maintain the status quo. Minimize work, report good news.
So they were ignoring minor banditry, failing to address local tax fraud.
Treating common unrest as just simple folk issues. They had grown accustomed to quiet management, which meant they were avoiding the messy reality of the countryside.
And Qianlong saw this inertia as a form of treachery.
A refusal to actively serve the imperial interest. He felt they were keeping the throne out of the loop to protect her own careers.
So he uses the sorcery scare as this high-stakes, instant litmus test for loyalty and competence, a way to suddenly whip his bureaucracy into shape.
Precisely. If they dismissed the rumors, they were complacent traitors hiding a rebellion. If they failed to find sorcerers, they were incompetent fools.
Yeah.
If they found dozens of cases, then they were covering up the true, centralized plot.
It's a no-win scenario.
A no-win scenario designed purely to consolidate autocratic control and force a sudden, violent injection of political energy into this stagnant system. He wanted them to fear him more than they feared the consequences of filing false reports.
And that dynamic is perfectly illustrated in the pressure he put on provincial leaders, like Governor Funahan. He found himself trying to navigate this impossible demand from the Forbidden City.
Funahan's case is a tragic study in imperial terror. I mean, imagine you're a provincial governor, you're responsible for a massive region, sitting in your office, your yamen, and reading a scathing imperial decree about a few snipped cues.
You know the cases are flimsy, based on village gossip and local grudges.
Of course. But the emperor wasn't looking for judicial truth. He was looking for political fervor. The decree essentially stated that the failure to find sorcerers was interpreted by the emperor as proof of the governor's own complicity.
Or at least a desire to cover up the real plot, just to keep things quiet.
Right, so the demand wasn't find the truth, it was find the conspirators or you are one of them.
He manufactured an enemy and then told his officials that only traitors could fail to find that enemy.
Exactly, and this forced every provincial chief to turn on his own subordinates, cracking down brutally on local magistrates and forcing them to produce arrests and forced confessions. The search for sorcerers in this context was purely a political exercise.
The ultimate tool for asserting his personal supremacy over the entire bureaucracy.
Overriding the traditional legalistic methods of governance with sheer, personalized imperial will. It's a classic authoritarian tactic.
Yeah.
Demand the impossible, use the failure to justify extreme measures, and reinforce your own ultimate authority.
But if the bureaucracy was complacent, they weren't the only ones fueling the fire. The panic had to find fertile ground in society to begin with.
That's right. And for that, we have to challenge this romanticized notion of the High King as a purely golden age.
It wasn't all peace and prosperity.
No. While the empire was objectively wealthy and militarily successful, underneath that veneer of prosperity, society was facing these massive systemic vulnerabilities that made it highly susceptible to mass hysteria.
What were these specific subterranean tensions that made a simple rumor about magic feel like the end of the world for ordinary people?
The single biggest disruptive force was demographic. China's population had doubled from roughly 150 million to 300 million between 1650 and 1800. This was an unprecedented explosion. And while the economy grew, it just could not keep pace with the sheer number of people needing land and resources.
Doubling the population in a relatively short time must have shattered the traditional social order.
It created intense, localized competition everywhere. Land ownership became increasingly fractionalized. That led to higher tenant rents and mass displacement.
Which in turn generated this massive rootless underclass.
A huge underclass. People forced off their ancestral land, moving to cities or living as internal migrants, searching desperately for any kind of marginal work. And these wanderers were seen by settled villagers as outsiders, as competitors, as potential threats.
So the fear of Jiao became the perfect mechanism to channel this profound social anxiety. The fear of sorcery was really the fear of the stranger.
Precisely. Sorcery provided a readily available, culturally accepted explanation for misfortune that was actually rooted in economic and social distress.
So when a village elder looked at the newly arrived beggars or the monks setting up a temporary camp,
they saw people who threatened their finite resources. And the Jiao rumor allowed them to define these individuals as existential threats, not just competition for food, but threats to the very spiritual integrity of their children.
It sounds like the state's massive political crisis was constantly being fed by the microscopic local grievances of ordinary villagers.
That's the most terrifying sociological layer of the entire scare. The state-sponsored panic created a space where ordinary, powerless people could suddenly settle personal scores through state-sanctioned persecution.
A local farmer normally had no legal power over his neighbor, let alone a traveling beggar.
None. The king hierarchy was rigid, but the sorcery scare handed them a loaded weapon.
Can you give us a concrete example of how this terrifying mechanism worked on the ground? How did a nobody suddenly gain the power to destroy a life?
Well, consider the case of a wandering beggar named Chiting. He was the ultimate outsider, rootless, poor, and relying on charity. In one village, a local man felt threatened or maybe just disliked Chiting's presence.
And in the climate of 1768, that was enough.
It was more than enough. The local man simply had to shout, "Soul stealer." He could accuse the beggar of clipping a piece of a child's hair or possessing a charm. Instantly, the state's massive, newly invigorated machinery of investigation, the very system Qianlong was using to whip his bureaucracy, snapped into action against this single defenseless man.
The official was now obligated to investigate, and the accusation, no matter how petty, aligned perfectly with the emperor's paranoia.
The local man had effectively outsourced his petty malice to the imperial state.
And that's the power of the powerless.
It's the very definition of it.
Yeah.
The farmer who started the witch hunt, the local villager who disliked the look of shooting these individuals, normally crushed by the weight of the king hierarchy, suddenly found they could destroy their enemies. They could vent their frustrations by simply whispering an accusation that aligned with the emperor's fear.
This created a truly chaotic environment of what's been called bottom-level mutual struggle.
It's a powerful term. The emperor was trying to control the high-level officials, but he unintentionally created this civil war of rumor and malice among the common people.
So the local populace weren't passive victims, they became active participants.
Active and enthusiastic participants. Using the campaign to destroy rivals, eliminate business competitors, or just remove individuals who were simply too strange or too poor. The state's power, intended to enforce imperial will, became diffused and chaotic. It was used for the benefit of petty malice,
Which in turn generated the false reports that terrified the emperor further up the chain.
The cycle became self-perpetuating, fueled by paranoia from the top and frustration from the bottom. It's really disturbing to realize that the Golden Age prosperity was such a thin mask over this collective trauma and intense social competition.
This fear wasn't about ghosts. It was about the lack of space, the lack of land, and the overwhelming presence of strangers in a world that felt fundamentally unstable. Once Qianlong was convinced of a widespread political conspiracy, the investigation was no longer about local order.
It was about national security. The emperor personally elevated the investigation, transforming it into a full-scale imperial inquisition.
He took direct control, bypassing the traditional legal channels.
He did. On September 7, 1768, Qianlong issued a definitive major edict. It wasn't a request. It was a command to 7 provincial governors-general to launch a supreme political struggle.
Demanding the mobilization of the masses.
Yes, to fight against the alleged sorcerers. He essentially told them to stop looking for simple thieves or magicians and start looking for traitors.
And when the autocrat demands evidence of treason, the bureaucracy, already terrified by what happened with Finihan, delivers. What kind of investigative methods followed this edict?
The methods devolved rapidly into institutionalized terror. Provincial magistrates, facing the death penalty for non-compliance, resorted to arrests, immediate imprisonment, and harrowing interrogations conducted under systematic torture.
To extract confessions that would satisfy the emperor's narrative.
Exactly. To satisfy his narrative of a widespread plot.
Can we be specific about the brutality? What were the accused, these mostly poor beggars and monks, subjected to?
The sources detail methods designed to break the physical and mental will of the accused. We have records mentioning the repeated application of severe pressure to the extremities. Specifically, breaking the ankles of prisoners to force a confession.
My God.
For these vagabonds, monks, and beggars, incarceration and torture were often a death sentence, regardless of their guilt. The entire machinery of state violence was deployed to retroactively confirm the emperor's paranoia.
This intense coercion poses a massive challenge for historians studying this event, doesn't it? If the primary evidence is based on confessions obtained under ankle-breaking torture, how can we truly analyze the reality of the events?
That is the central methodological challenge when you work with Imperial Chinese archives. It's a vital point to stress. The trial files, the confessions, the official reports, everything used to reconstruct the event are structurally polluted by forced confessions.
The goal of the prisoner wasn't to tell the truth.
It was to provide a narrative that would stop the pain. This means we can't determine the factual extent of the sorcery. We can only analyze the political reaction to it.
And yet, paradoxically, even Qianlong himself had to grapple with this problem. He drove the campaign, but he also couldn't entirely trust the bloody evidence it generated.
He was aware of the quality issue. The emperor, being the ultimate arbiter, would sometimes read these contradictory, often absurd confessions and realize they bore the hallmarks of fabrication. He understood the mechanism of his own system. Fear produced lies.
But for a time, his need for political affirmation, for proof that his government was being proactive, outweighed his need for judicial integrity.
It did. But the campaign could only sustain itself on lies for so long.
It seems impossible for an autocrat like Qianlong to admit he was wrong. So how did this political purge finally collapse? Who had the political weight and the skill to stop the emperor without directly contradicting him?
The collapse was a high-stakes, subtle political maneuver. It was orchestrated by the mandarins at the absolute highest level, specifically the Grand Counselors Qianlong's internal cabinet and primary administrative body.
And unlike the provincial officials, who were terrified of being accused of a cover-up,
These high-ranking literati mandarins were generally skeptical of the sorcery rumors. They couldn't challenge the emperor's paranoia directly, but they sought to subtly halt the movement by exposing its internal contradictions.
they needed a way for the emperor to save face, to declare victory even as he was retreating from the investigation.
That's where the key intervention came from the Minister of Justice, Lu Tongson. Lu was one of the most respected officials of the era. He used his unique access to the incoming case files to systematically dismantle the provincial reports.
He didn't argue that the sorcerers didn't exist, did he?
No, that would have been political suicide. He argued that the reports proved the incompetence and deceit of the provincial governors.
Can you elaborate on that logic? That's the crucial political chess move.
Lu Tongson realized that simply denying the conspiracy would label him a traitor. So instead, he presented the emperor with a meticulously organized catalog of absurdities.
For example,
He pointed out cases where the alleged sorcerer confessed to having stolen souls in 3 different provinces on the same day. He highlighted confessions that were contradictory, where the supposed victim was obviously still healthy, or where the stolen Q clippings were later proven to be animal hair or just dust,
and he framed these contradictions not as proof that Jiao was fake.
but as irrefutable proof that the provincial governors were lying to the throne.
That is brilliant. He shifted the focus from the reality of the sorcery to the failure of the bureaucracy to produce credible evidence.
Which reinforced Qianlong's core belief that his officials were hiding the truth while giving him a political off-ramp.
The emperor could proudly declare that his sharp insight had exposed the pervasive corruption and incompetence of his local officials, who had manufactured flimsy cases to protect themselves.
He had won the bureaucratic struggle. Having secured that political victory, he could then safely call off the movement, concluding that the original rumors were indeed false, spread by panicked, dishonest subordinates.
So, after this intense, months-long national purge, what was the lasting legacy, particularly in human terms?
Well, the conclusion was that no large-scale conspiracy or hidden rebel network was ever proven, but the human cost was devastating. We can't quantify the numbers precisely due to poor record-keeping for the marginalized, but we know that dozens of innocent people, the vagabonds, the beggars, the roving clergy, were maimed, died in prison, or were executed as a result of incarceration and torture.
Their suffering was the invisible price paid for the emperor's political maneuver.
The price to discipline his government, yes.
And finally, bringing this back to the long view of the Qing dynasty, Qianlong used this scare to fix the bureaucracy, but did it actually cure that gravitational inertia and corruption?
In the short term, it injected terror and obedience. But the underlying systemic flaws, the deep corruption, the financial mismanagement, the fundamental challenge of governing a massive, rapidly expanding population, they persisted. The sorcery scare was a violent, temporary shock treatment.
It didn't address the root causes of the bureaucratic malaise.
Not at all. And by the time Qianlong died in 1799, that unchecked decay had progressed significantly. It led almost immediately to genuine massive uprisings, most famously the White Lotus Rebellion.
Which was a far more genuine and destructive threat to the dynasty than any alleged Q-clipping occultist ever was.
By an order of magnitude. The 1768 scare was a symptom of the sickness, not a cure for the High King. Ultimately, the whole episode provides this compelling commentary on the nature of power. It reinforces the idea that the golden age of the king was underpinned by deep insecurity, ethnic, political, and sociological.
The emperor's use of fear against his own government shows that even the most powerful autocrat harbors these profound anxieties about subversion and control.
Anxieties he was willing to address by unleashing mass hysteria upon the common populace. The case of the Soul Sealers reveals that the true threat to the king was never a foreign army or a hidden cult, but the dynamic instability inherent in trying to govern a vast, rapidly changing empire through paranoia and centralized terror.
The lesson is enduring and relevant. The politics of fear always finds fertile ground where social tension is high. The story shows how the paranoid actions of a single autocrat, combined with deep demographic stress and the ability of ordinary people to harness that fear to settle petty grudges, can transform a minor local incident into a brutal nationwide tool of political purge. The 1768 sorcery scare provides a horrifying, intimate glimpse into imperial China, demonstrating how the line between magic and high-level political conspiracy is often blurred only by the calculated will of the state.